In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to take in a suit pant waist. If you've ever been curious about alterations to waists, this is a great one to start with because suit pants are really very straightforward. The way that they are designed, if you look at the center back seam, you'll notice that right away you can tell whether or not you've got any seam allowance to let the pant out, or of course you can always take it in. Now, there's limits within reason, and the limit for me is I won't go in far enough, I won't take the pant in enough that these pockets start to look odd or even begin to get within touching range. That's a no-go for me because then you're going to be pulling the pocket and the side seam way too far to the back. So let's say that we're staying within a range of 4 inches in or out, but that's really going to be the definite max. Now, with this pant, we are taking it in, so the seam allowance that we have right now doesn't make a difference for us because that only comes into play if we're letting it out. Next up, we are just going to open this section of the waistband, which you'll see flips right up. Then we can get into moving this right in and merging that out through the seat. It's going to be really nice and easy. So let's get seam ripping and see what we've got. Real quick, before we get started, important note, this is more of a beginner waist operation. If you're looking for something more advanced, like taking in a jeans waist on some denim, that video is going to be over here. Take a look at that one instead and start with this, move to that. All right, let's jump back in. Here we are looking at the inside of the pant at the center back seam. Typically, you're going to have a tack holding the inner flap of the waistband down to the seam allowance. This is a really easy way to get in. You're just going to cut that tack, and then most of the time, this is just going to flip directly up. Isn't that crazy? So check this out. What we're looking at is not only the amount that we have to let the waist out, if we'd like, but also one continuous seam that goes all the way through the waistband and down the seat all the way to the crotch. So really easy access to, again, that one singular continuous seam. Now, if you need to open this a little bit more and you need a little more room to work, you can begin to release the stitching that's holding the waistband also to the back pocket bags. So these pocket bags are connected to these pockets. You see how far they come over here? That's what we're looking at. Now, I've cut those tacks as well. So, like I said, I'm ready to flip this up. Now, I'm going to try to get this waistband pushed together as flat as I can. I can feel a detail in here. This little guy, this is just for, I think it's just for actually display purposes. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull that out so that I can get this seam nice and flush. But I am not gonna open this seam, and you will see why. I like to use that seam kind of in place of pins, or let's say to support the pins when I place them. And we're actually going to sew our new seam before we open this initial seam. All right, almost there, just a few more stitches. And I'm actually not going to put this back. This doesn't serve any function, so I'm just going to set that off to the side. Perfect. Okay. So you can see that center back seam here. Now, one of the really important things, let's flip back out to the outside. We are trying to take in this pant 1.5 inches. Now, when we come back into the center, we're folding the pant on itself and working on what we would call the double. What does that mean? We are not going to measure 1.5 inches from this seam. We are only going to measure 3/4 of an inch because that is half. Let me show you one more time. Half the distance from this seam is 3/4 of an inch for a total of 1.5. So when we go in and we start pinning the new take-in, we are only doing half the amount because we've got both sides of that seam pinched together in our fingers. If this doesn't make sense, it will make more sense as we continue. I'm going to cut a little more of this stitching holding the waistband down so that I can get a little more flexibility back here. It's really important while we're doing this to make sure that all of the seam allowances are in the places that they're supposed to be. For instance, this does not want to be flipped down like that. This does not want to be flipped down like that. However, this is originally stitched, as you can see, we are going to maintain that stitching just closer in to make that waist a little bit tighter. So I'm holding this up, and now I'm going to put a little pin in there to hold everything in place, and then I'm going to measure that 3/4 of an inch in from this seam. Let me put a chalk mark here so that you can see there's some black stitching right there, and we're going to go 3/4 of an inch in, almost all the way to my pin. Great, perfect. I'm going to pull some more of the pant out here so that it's easier to see, and we're going to start working our way down. Now again, like I said, I'm pulling the seam allowances to make sure that I'm pinning and chalking flat against the fabric. What does that mean? I don't want any pinches like this. You see how I'm holding that there with my finger? I don't want any pinches caught because that's going to look weird on the outside. Let me see if I can show you that. See? You see that right there? That's the fabric being pinched together. So we're just going to avoid any unevenness and bumps by pulling the fabric taut, placing our pins to help us, and then actually making that chalked line. Now, last most important detail is from here, which is actually the bottom of the inside of the waistband, flipped up. From here all the way to this seam, which is our waist seam. We know that because we can see that this is going into the uninterfaced seat. Interfacing is here. Waistband ends at this seam and seat continues below. From the bottom to the top of the waistband, this line must be straight. Let me repeat that because it's extremely important. You must take in an equal amount from the original seam to the new seam all the way through both the internal and external components of the waistband. If you make any kind of, oh, I'm just going to merge it out here because I want it a little bit bigger here and a little bit more there. No. If you curve that line in any way, I promise it will tip the waistband down at an awkward angle and it will never look right. This must be straight. Once you get to that waistband seam, now you are allowed to start curving in to meet that seat. Because even though we are taking in the waistband, this customer may not need the seat taken in all the way down. So we're going to take our seam here, but we're going to gently merge it down back into the original seam before we get to the crotch. Most of the time when we're making a waist adjustment, we're not going to make such a large adjustment on the hips or seat. So again, we're merging in long, slow, gentle slope. We can't go straight from the waistband. Oh, we're just going to go straight back out to the seat. No way, that's going to look terrible. No hard edges here. It's got to be slow and smooth, okay? So what are we going to do now? We're going to take this over to the sewing machine and we're going to sew our straight line that is taking in 3/4 of an inch and then merge gently out to our seam. And don't forget, we have not released the original stitching yet. We'll get to that next. All right, let's go sew. here we are at the machine. I'm going to take out my pins, but my hand placement is going to be really important here. So I'm going to use all of my fingers to help me smooth and spread out the multiple layers of fabric on this waistband. The other thing that's really important is that I am kind of tipping the fabric up. You see how I'm kind of holding it at a curved angle? That's going to be necessary for a good smooth feed. But also remember, so much of the pant is still connected to itself. We've actually released very little stitching, and so the pant needs to be curved a little bit as we're feeding it in to make sure that each angle stays correct. You'll understand what I mean as we go. See, because out here, this angle is not ready to be fed into the machine yet. It won't be until it gets there. So let's sew so that I can show you what I mean. I'm gonna give a back stitch at the top there. I am at a lower stitch length, probably at a 2.5. And you see how much I'm using my fingers to feed that. I'm also keeping an eye on that seam, the original seam that's still in there, and making sure that I'm keeping it equidistant. As long as I'm going through this waistband, I have got to keep that 3/4 inch distance. Ooh, this is where it gets really tricky. You can see those little bumps there, and that's where that feed and pulling both down and to the sides is going to be really important. Here we go. And I'm gently pulling sections of the waistband toward me as I move. All right, we are coming up to the bottom of the waistband seam, which means now that we've crossed over that seam, we are able to start curving gently in so that we can merge this seam up with the rest of our seat. So we are running down the seat of the pants right now, heading towards the crotch. And I'm just keeping that smooth, sloping until we go all the way to meeting up with that seam. And then I'm definitely gonna backstitch over top of that seam. Okay. Let's take it over to the iron and see how we did. So we're over here at the iron because the next big important thing is we're gonna see how we did, and we're gonna find that out by finally releasing that original stitching. But I'm gonna peek on the outside just to see. So not very smooth quite yet because we have some ironing to do, but I can see that I'm almost perfectly matched up with my waist seams. That's something that I really, really care about because visually it's so important. But also this kind of, you see how this is sort of curved and not quite flat? We have to release the original stitching and give that a really good press open on the curved hem here before we're actually gonna get an accurate idea of where our seam is. Then we can make adjustments if necessary. So let's jump inside. And I'm just gonna kind of go between. The stitching on your waistband, customarily for a suit jacket, is going to be regular. So a regular lock stitch with a bobbin and spool, just like typical home sewing. Whereas the seam that's on your seat is often going to be an individual chain stitch. And what that means is once we individually seam rip the stitching on the waistband, we will actually be able to unravel that seat seam. And I'm going to show you that in just a moment here. So let's finish this up. And I want to be really careful here because if you cut any holes while you're doing this seam ripping and we need to make any further adjustments to these pants, or in the future they need to be let back out, those holes are really hard to impossible to fix. So please be super careful when you're seam ripping this. Also, I always clean as I go. So let's pull out that stitching so that that doesn't get wrapped up in any of the seams that we're making. Ooh, and I just caught, that's perfect, perfect segue. So I just caught my fingernail in the stitching for the seam. Once you cut a few of these stitches, like I did, this one side, and you'll know because one side looks like regular stitching and one side looks like denser, almost knitted stitching. That side, as soon as you've cut a few of the stitches, is going to unravel because it is a chain stitch. Now, if you didn't run your new stitching all the way down and cross over that original stitching, you're screwed. Just kidding. But it will continue to unravel all the way to the crotch, so be careful. Don't let that stitching run away on you. And I'm going to cut this off and cut a few more stitches. Perfect. Now I'm going to come back over to the other side that had the normal looking stitching and just pull that off, because without the chain stitch holding it on the other side, that's it. This procedure, again, I'm just going to say this again, really good to clean as you go. Pull out all of that previous stitching. Don't leave all of that in there. It's not only confusing, but messy and can just get in the way. And you'll have to do it again later, so let's keep it clean. All right, now we're going to press this seam open from the inside and from the outside. I like to do this on my ham. I don't know if we've talked about the ham. This is a tailor's ham, and it's usually got a plaid surface. I don't know why. If you do know why, I'd love to know. And it's a flat, hard, but also curved surface. The reason that I like this is because our waists and seats are not flat. So though I could just press it directly on the board here, and there's nothing wrong with that, I do like to have the ham because our bodies are curved, and pressing seams on a very slightly curved structure I find to be helpful, especially when we're molding and we're working with suits, suit pants, suit jackets. It can just be really nice for getting that good bodily shape. Still just pulling out some of my stitching here. And I'm going to keep moving the waist down and the seat up. It also gives me a little bit of a raised surface so that I'm not pressing extra creases into other sections of the pant. I find that convenient as well. All right, looking good. Now, I'm going to tuck my waistband back in. And when I do that, this is an aesthetic thing, but often these edges are raw. You see that? They're almost always left that way in suit pants. I'm going to just fold that down like that, literally just holding it in place, and then tip that under, and I'm going to press it that way just because it's pretty. You could also tack those down that way. We probably will at the end. All right. Ooh, that's looking good. All right, let's flip to the outside now. Perfect. Okay, now we can really see what we've done. And right out the gate, I noticed something that I don't like that I am going to fix. Do you see the way that this tips? Kind of down to a point like that? That is because I did not keep my seam perfectly straight all the way through the waistband. I took in a little too much here and a little less down here, and that's why we're getting that tipped edge like that. So I'm going to go back over to the sewing machine, and I'm going to sew this center point. Internal waistband, external waistband, top. I'm going to sew that point just a little bit less so that it will be parallel and totally in line with the rest of the waistband. So let's take that over and I'll chalk it over there. Anytime I'm making a correction, I'm only going to pull out the stitching for exactly where I need it. I'm not going to pull out all of the stitching. We really want to keep everything else in place. I am just looking at the top of that waistband, so I'm going to pull this nice and flat. I've got my fingers under either edge there, and I'm going to straighten that out and get these two seams to meet. This is my internal waistband. And then I'm going to come to the inside here, and I'm going to put a little pin right there. Okay, and then if I look to the outside again, I can see that those are lined up. So that is going to work. Let me put one more pin in here, even though we are immediately going to take these out when we're sewing. We are never going to sew with the pins in. They are warping the fabric by holding it in place, so we're never going to keep them in. But that'll take us the few inches we need to get back over. All right, I'm just going to start at the very top again, just for my own sanity. And then I'm going to give myself this little chalk line here and down there and pull the pin out at the very last minute. But you notice I use that finger to hold that in place so that nothing would move, just as I'm already down on the sewing machine bed. And now again, I'm using my fingers to try to pull and straighten everything in place, holding everything down as I pull those pins out. This part of the waistband, spoiler, I should have led with this, is the trickiest part, because it's the highest point in the peak. Okay, and I can see that I am meeting up with my previous stitching. And let's peek and see, how did we do? Missed it again. Alrighty, third time's the charm. Let's see if we can do it. And I'm looking underneath, making sure that I'm actually smoothing all of my seam allowances where I want them to be while I'm holding them on the top. I'm holding them on the top with my fingers and the bottom with my thumbs. Almost. And I'm lifting to readjust the fabric as I feel pinches. So that's what you're watching me do. There we go. There we go. Bam, 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 bam. That is a nice lineup. Now, I will admit this is the inside, so maybe it doesn't matter that much, but it matters to me. Okay, let's press her again. Alrighty. Obviously, I'm feeling optimistic. I'm going to start on the inside, and just like before, I'm going to press these seams away from each other. Fold this waistband that will ultimately go on the inside, and I'm holding that in place, and then I'm pressing that down. Yeah, this is gonna work. Great. I molded a little with my fingers, just like any suit. There's gonna be a lot of human touch that's gonna get us to where we want to be. And just pulling a couple of little threads out from our previous stitching, clean that up. And we can always clip those threads later. Right now, we are just looking at that waist seam. And that is looking good. I'm gonna go back and forth a couple of times. I'm really just feeling it out wherever I want to press and make that seam really flat. It just needs to be flat, and it needs to be open. You can't press those seam allowances to one side or the other. With a suit pant, it really has got to be totally flat, totally open. Perfect. I'm also molding it with my hands because I'm trying not to give it an excessive amount of pressure. The pressure and the heat are really important, but as you know, they are intense. They can be wearing on the fabric. So I'm trying to support the integrity of the fabric by also using my hands to help. Okay. Ooh, I am liking this. The other thing that I'm looking at as I'm sitting here pressing is, if I have belt loops, are the belt loops aligned? And if I have pockets, are the pockets equidistant from that center back seam? Everything is looking pretty good here to me. Awesome. Next up, and last step, unbelievably, is putting those tacks back on the seam allowance and the waistband to hold this flap from flapping up. All right, let's tack it down. You remember when we were over at the ironing station, we flipped these down, and that was just to keep the raw edge from showing once our waistband is reattached. So let's just flip that edge down at a slight angle again. Then, holding that in place, we're going to flatten that against our seam allowance in the back here. And you'll notice it's quite a bit bigger now because we've taken it in. So let's hold that in place, and then we're just going to put a pin right at the edge there. That's just holding this waistband down, but as you can see, it is loosely tacked all the way around. So we're just putting back that original tack that we lifted so that we could get inside. Let's do on the same on the other. We've got that little bit of a turn up, held against the waistband, slip our fingers under that seam allowance of the center back seam, and then put a little pin. Now, I'm just going to throw a few stitches under the machine in there, but I'm going to hold this up and look at it and make sure this looks a little bit pinched here. So I'm going to smooth that out just a little bit. And again, it's really important that this pin doesn't go through all the way to the outside. It's only on the inside. There we go. Perfect. Great. All right, let's pop that under the machine. I have my fingers underneath so that the only thing being sewn together is the waistband and the edge of the hem allowance. I'm going to place my presser foot down as I'm pulling out that pin and just, that's it. Flip around and one more on the other side. Same thing here, placing my fingers under and holding everything in place so that when I release that pin, we are only sewing those two layers together. A little back and forth. Good to go. Dun 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 dun. And here we have it, folks. Just as a refresher, this should look 1.5 inches wider than it did before. And from the outside, we can see that the belt loops are closer, but other than that, should look like we were never there. So this is all set, good to go. Don't know what I want to do next? They're not my pants, so I guess I could give them back. Don't forget, questions, comments, concerns? No, not concerns. Only nice things, please. Just kidding. Leave me everything in the comments below. And like, subscribe, and see you soon. Thanks so much.